This video will break down how to land a remote software engineering job without a computer science degree or prior experience. I'll go over why you might want a remote role, how remote hiring differs from in-person hiring, factors you need to consider, and a 6-phase roadmap that you could start following today to land a remote offer. With that said, let's get into it. So first, let's go over why you might want a remote software engineering role. Now, of course, there's advantages and disadvantages, but generally speaking, I would say a remote role is far superior to an in-person role because of the freedom that it allows you. This often means you're going to save a massive amount of time on your day-to-day. You're not going to have 8 to 10 hours where you're either commuting or in a physical location where you can't really do anything else. And really, it's going to be a lot more focused on you just completing tasks as opposed to the amount of hours that you actually physically spend doing a particular job. In my personal experience, I almost always find when I'm working remotely that I spend less hours working and I get more done because I'm able to manage my time by myself and also to go and handle all of the other tasks that might be stacking up during the day in whatever order or whatever priority I see fit. For people that are self-starters that are able to regulate their own time and that don't need to be in a physical location in order to be focused, for example, you don't need to go to another building in order to get something done, I think remote work is a massive benefit. And if you're someone who likes to travel or you want to have some flexibility in your schedule or your life, of course, remote work is going to do that, whereas in-person work can be extremely limited. Anyways, I don't think I need to sell you on remote work, but now what I want to do is talk about how remote hiring differs from in-person hiring. So on-site or hybrid hiring is typically optimizing for culture fit via proximity, training and mentorship due to the fact that you're going to be working with people a lot more closely than if you were remote, the local market availability of these employees, and the long-term in-office presence. Whereas remote hiring is usually going to optimize for trust and autonomy, asynchronous communication, proven output, and a lower management overhead. In-person teams are usually going to be more expensive, but they can come with some benefits, especially the team bonding, right? And the relationships that you would build when you're seeing people every single day. Now, with that in mind, let's quickly talk about location, because as much as remote jobs do technically mean you could do them from anywhere, where you are located does have some impact. So the things that actually matter when someone's hiring you for a remote job, first of all, is going to be the time zone. Pretty clear, but you need to be usually within 3 to 5 hours of the time zone where the actual physical office or most of the team members is located. Meaning, if you live in India, for example, it's going to be difficult for you to work for a company in San Francisco or in New York due to the massive time difference. For example, I'm in Dubai, and whenever I have to do meetings with people in San Francisco, it is extremely difficult to coordinate that because it's either very early morning for me or very late at night for me or vice versa for them, right? So there's never a good time to schedule it. Next, legal and payroll. So depending on the jurisdiction that you're from and the jurisdiction that you want to work in, even as a contractor, that can be a little bit tricky. So for example, as a Canadian citizen living in Canada, it's going to be a lot easier to get a remote job in the United States than if you live in Cambodia, right? For many different reasons. Next, salary expectations. Usually as a remote employee, you can expect to be paid less, especially depending on where you actually live. And that's one of the main reasons that companies will hire remote is to reduce cost. So hopefully that gives you a bit more intel into remote hiring and remote roles. And now what I want to do is get into the 6-phase roadmap that explains how you can actually land a remote software engineering job. Now let's start with phase 0, which is to choose a remote friendly role. Now, this is pretty straightforward, but there are a lot of roles that just aren't going to be hiring for remote developers. And there's some that are predominantly remote roles. So if you pick the right area, it's going to drastically increase your chance of being able to land a remote position. Now, here are some roles that are consistently going to be remote friendly. Not always going to be remote, but a lot of times you're going to see this more often with these roles. So for example, backend or API engineers, full stack, kind of usually backend leaning, but sometimes full stack developers, platform engineers, infrastructure engineers, DevOps, data engineering, internal tooling engineers, those are usually going to be friendly for remote, and companies typically don't mind if they already have remote developers if you do something like that from your home. Whereas here are some roles that are a little bit more difficult to land and aren't as remote friendly. So we have entry-level front-end developers, UI heavy roles tied closely to like product or design teams, pretty much any kind of junior role, or anything that's highly regulated or on-prem dependent. For example, if you're working for a government or somewhere in the defense sector, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to get a remote role there for pretty obvious reasons. So with all that in mind, consider what skills you already have and what areas you're interested in, and try to align those with roles that are going to be more remote friendly, because that increases your chance of actually landing a remote job. So this leads us to phase 1, which is skill foundation. Now, during this phase, you need to work on building your technical skills so that you can demonstrate your competency and the fact that you can work on your own without someone looking over your shoulder. And I mean that physically, right? If you're working like in person. So you need to understand core language fundamentals, so deep C++ knowledge, deep Python knowledge, deep JavaScript knowledge, right? Depending on what you're doing, HTTP, APIs, authentication, databases, things like debugging and error handling, and then of course writing readable and maintainable code. Now all of this is going to be specific to the type of industry or kind of niche that you've chosen, but I will say that a lot of the kind of remote friendly roles are going to have Python as a prerequisite. So if you're wondering what language should I learn here, I would highly suggest getting into Python, because that's going to cover backend development, infrastructure, DevOps, and almost all of the skills that I mentioned above. Now if you are in this phase and you are going to learn a language like Python, I want to share with you the truth. Now, when I was breaking into software engineering myself, I learned very quickly that hands-on interactive learning makes all the difference. Now, when you're just watching tutorials or reading blog posts, you might retain maybe 20% of what you see, but when you learn actively by writing code and solving real problems, your retention can jump to 75 to 90%. And that gap really matters if your goal is to actually get hired. Now, that's exactly why I always recommend DataCamp when it comes to learning Python for software engineering. Now, they're sponsoring this video, and I'm excited to tell you about their Associate Python Developer career track. Now, since Python is one of the most in-demand skills for remote software engineering and developer roles, this track is one of the best ways that I've found to build real, job-ready skills through a fully interactive learning experience. The curriculum focuses on fundamentals that actually matter on the job, so things like APIs, core data structures, debugging, writing clean, readable Python, etc. Now, these are the exact skills that you need before you start building serious projects and positioning yourself for remote work. It's not magic, it's not a shortcut, and it's not going to get you the job on its own, but it gives you a structured, hands-on path to build your foundation properly instead of guessing what to do next. Now, I've used DataCamp myself and recommended it on this channel for years because learning is practical and you're actively coding on their platform from day one. And right now, DataCamp is offering 25% off when you use my link in the description. So if you're serious about learning Python the right way and landing a remote software engineer or developer role fast, then don't miss out and check it out. Okay, so now let's move on to phase 2, which assumes that you've built some of these core skills. Now, the next thing that you need to do is build hireable projects. Now, what you really need to demonstrate here is that you have the ability to write and develop projects and code on your own. If someone's going to hire a remote software engineer, they're typically not interested in training you heavily, they're not going to be mentoring you super in depth, and it's just going to be more difficult for them to do that anyways because of the fact that you're remote. So they're going to look for someone that really has that autonomy and the ability to go out and do something on their own. So I would highly suggest having 1 to 3 very clear, very distinct projects on your resume that speak to the niche that you're trying to get into. So for example, if you're going for a backend job, have a project that's really deep into APIs. If you're going for a machine learning role, then you would have a really deep machine learning project, right? Don't scatter them, don't have a bunch of different ones. Make sure they line up with what it is that you're trying to position yourself for. Now, what I always tell people is that one project that shows technical depth is always going to outpace 5, 6, 7 random small projects. So you want to make sure you have things like a clear README file, what the project does, why you decided to do it, decisions you made, different trade-offs you had, and something that is technically complex and that overall you're proud to show off. So again, focus on 1 to 3 projects. I would say 2 is definitely the sweet spot. Make sure they're completely tailored to the type of role that you're going for. Don't build a front-end heavy project if you're going for a back-end role. If you can get those on your resume, not only is that going to build some confidence for you, but it's going to give you some proof that you can go back to say, hey, yes, I do know what I'm doing because I've done XYZ. I've built this, I got a user on this project, etc. So this moves us to phase 3, which is resume and positioning. Now, you can build the projects, you can build the technical depth, but really the most important, highest leverage task when it comes to landing any type of software dev role, but especially a remote role, is having the right resume, the right LinkedIn, and the right positioning. Now, when I say positioning, this is you aligning what it is that you've done, your outcomes, your previous experience, right? The projects, your summary, your education with the target role that you're going for. So like I said at the beginning, we've hopefully picked a role that's going to be remote friendly. We're now looking online at companies that are hiring remote software developers, and we're positioning ourselves to align as closely as possible with those expectations. So the general rule of thumb when it comes to resumes, especially if you're below a mid-level developer, is that you want to have a one-page resume. It should be role specific, which means you shouldn't have one resume that speaks to front end, back end, DevOps. It should speak to one particular niche. You need to focus on the outcomes, not on the tasks. So you need to say, what did I actually get done? What impact did I provide? What was I doing? What was my actual task? And what did that lead to, right? So a lot of people just say, like, built an API. Why did you build the API? What did the API do? What impact did you actually have? That's the most important thing that you want to highlight. Now, when it comes to your projects, as much as you can put them on there, you also want to frame it like this was real development work. The bullet points that you have for your projects can match closely to something that you might have for work experience, so you can really demonstrate, again, the expertise and the knowledge that you built by building this project. You also want to make sure that you remove anything that you can't defend in an interview or that isn't giving you a benefit. Don't tell me that you won the spelling bee in grade 9. Yes, some people literally put that on your resume. And then last point I'll say specifically for remote jobs is you want to focus a lot of the bullet points on you taking initiative, you getting something done on your own, right? You going above and beyond your management skills, your communication skills. Think about the differences in development skill that's required when you're working by yourself on your own computer and you can't quickly, tap on someone's shoulder beside you and ask them to review your code. That's what recruiters are going to be looking for the remote job specifically. So I would also highlight that in your professional summary. And again, make sure that you're touching on some of those soft skills and communication skills so they know that you would fit with this type of remote work culture. So now we move to the job search phase. And this is going to be probably the most difficult phase for most of you out there. But overall, what you need to try to do is generate the most number of inbound and outbound opportunities. So when it comes to inbound, that means people actually reaching out to you. The easiest way to do that is to make a killer LinkedIn profile. Make sure that you have keywords in your headline. Make sure that, again, you're targeting a specific niche and that you're not being too general, that you have a clean professional photo, that you have a banner, that everything is complete, everything is filled in, and immediately when someone comes to your profile, they know exactly the value that you can provide. Even including remote engineer is totally fine. Just make sure that it's very clear when someone looks at your profile that you're worth bringing in. I cannot tell you how many engineers have completely crap LinkedIn profiles, and by simply spending 30 minutes improving it, you can literally double or triple the amount of inbound opportunities you get. A lot of students in my DevLaunch program actually end up landing jobs because recruiters found them on LinkedIn after they tweaked a few small things, so definitely don't underestimate that. Now next we get to the outbound, right? Now when it comes to the outbound, if you are looking for a remote role, it's going to be more likely that smaller teams or startups are looking for remote engineers, especially to save on cost or ones that don't have an office. So if you don't care about working for a massive big tech company where a lot of them will hire remote as well, definitely consider looking at places like Y Combinator, where you have a ton of small startups that are always looking for talent, right? Look at other places where you have smaller companies and ones that are maybe disconnected or that are known as remote companies, right? So rather than doing a role first outreach, do a company first search where you're identifying companies that hire remote software engineers and then tailoring your application specifically to that. Doing things like cold outreach on LinkedIn, reaching out directly to engineers that work there or the founders of the company makes a massive difference. And then, of course, tracking your applications and responses is always going to be helpful so you know what you're actually putting out, what's coming in, and what's generating responses and what's not. Now, this leads me to my final phase, which is remote interview preparation. Now, putting aside how to prepare for technical interviews, which I have many rounds on, I want to talk about what's specifically different about remote interviews, especially ones over like Google, Zoom, whatever, as opposed to an in-person interview or really for those types of roles. So if you're being interviewed for a remote software developer role, a lot of the time they are going to try to gauge how much they can trust you, how much autonomy you take, if you're a self-starter, if you take initiative, if you're able to solve problems and deal with obstacles on your own, or if you really need someone like physically there beside you, training you, teaching you, getting you up to speed. So keep that in mind, especially during the behavioral rounds, that you really need to be a very strong communicator. So that means even in like the written replies that you give people, the emails that you send back to the recruiter, everything should really just be tightly knit, put together, and not give them any reason to eliminate you. Again, when you hire someone remote, you're just inherently putting more trust into that person because you're not going to see them every single day and you don't really know what they're doing, with all of their hours. So just have that in the back of your mind and make sure that the answers that you give demonstrate that you can be trusted, that you take initiative, that you can solve problems on your own, and that you don't need to be closely monitored, and you're capable of actually providing value from day one. Now, along those lines, if you're going to be working remotely, I also suggest having a remote work setup. So not just working on your, kitchen counter or working on the couch, having a proper setup, ideally an office, but if not an office, at least a dedicated workspace where you maybe have a monitor, you maybe have a docking station, you have a proper camera. It doesn't need to be like my camera, but a dedicated webcam, a microphone, right? Not a keyboard that's super loud that's going to annoy all of your coworkers, some basic lighting, and just an environment where you can show up prepared and look professional on the call. Someone that has like a really messy setup and I can see like, McDonald's bags behind them and they show up without their hair combed, that's just a bad look. But you'd be surprised how many software developers do that. Even when you're sitting in your chair for a remote interview, don't be like spinning around like this, right? And like wandering and leaning back. Like sit up straight, have a good posture, speak clearly, look into the camera lens because it looks like you're actually looking into the other person's eyes, as opposed to like if I look at my screen right now while you're talking to me, it looks a little bit weird, but that's where I would be looking at the other person. So just small tips like that can really make a big difference, especially for first impressions, and just make sure you're set up well for remote work so you can be efficient, productive, and again, look good on camera. Of course, we have all of the technical rounds, the system design, the leak code stuff, right? That's another story. I'm not going to get into that here. The point is, optimize yourself for a remote job. So with that said, that's going to wrap up my roadmap. Let me know what you think of this in the comments down below. If you have any tips for remote work, I would love to hear it, and I will see you in another video.